compression, bokeh, and getting close when you can't. These are 3 key things that are great about a telephoto lens. But what exactly is a telephoto lens and why should you use one? Today's video aims to give you a basic, practical understanding of the telephoto focal lengths. I'll talk through the difference between a telephoto and wide-angle lens. Then I'll differentiate between zoom lenses and prime lenses and how they're related to telephoto lenses. And finally, as usual, I'll share some of my favorite tips on the subject and show you some favorite telephoto lens techniques. I'm Brenda Bergering, giving you practical photography advice to complement Mark's gear reviews from our real-world experience as husband and wife photo video team. Hit subscribe, it helps us out. First up, focal lengths. We need to address what a telephoto lens is and what differentiates it from the other focal lengths, such as wide-angle lenses. When I say telephoto or wide, I'm referring to the focal length of the lens. Now, focal length is the measurement in millimeters from the point where the light meets inside a camera lens to the camera sensor. So you see here this white dot indicates the location of the camera sensor. So the light meets inside the camera lens, and then focal length is the distance from that point to this camera sensor. So from here to here. So from the point where the light meets inside the lens, which will be different on different focal lengths. So let's say here, 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 from the point inside the lens to the sensor, point inside the lens to the sensor, point inside the lens to the sensor. Longer focal lengths, like 85 and higher, are telephoto lenses, and they give you a narrow angle of view. Whereas wide focal lengths, like 35 and lower, give you wider angles of view. Angle of view is more commonly heard of as field of view, but using the word angle is a nice reminder of what's happening with your wide angle or narrow angle lenses. Now, one thing to note is that the angle of view is dependent on the lens, but also the sensor size. A smaller sensor will have a narrower angle of view, which is why you have to multiply by 1.5 if you're using a crop sensor lens. So next, let's discuss the impact of this narrow angle that we get with telephoto lenses. All this talk of angles is important because otherwise you might think that a longer lens just zooms things in. Switching from a 35mm shot to a 200mm shot does more than just zoom in on the subject. Instead, it changes the angle or field of view. Longer lenses magnify the subject while also compressing the distance between objects. Conversely, wide lenses expand the distance between objects, which is why things can start to look distorted with wider lenses. To me, one way to think about this is to imagine drawing railroad tracks converging on a mountain in perspective. If you've ever tried to draw anything, you know in order to make a 2D drawing look 3D, you have to use perspective. And perspective is all about vanishing points and angles. Now I'm getting into the weeds where I don't actually know what I'm talking about, but a wide angle would make the background look small relative to the railroad, whereas a narrow angle would make it appear closer. I'm actually really curious about how all of that works, so feel free to share your knowledge in the comments. But let's jump ahead to what matters, which is creating depth and perspective. There are a lot of tools and techniques that photographers use to create depth in our photography. Photographers use depth of field, which creates bokeh blur that adds depth. Make sure you check out my bokeh video for more on that. As you'll learn more about in that video, telephoto lenses produce more bokeh or background blur than wider angle lenses because the depth of field is narrower due to the narrow angle of view. The background blur separates the subject from the background, adding a more 3D quality to the image. Photographers also use composition techniques, such as leading lines, which makes me think of those perspective drawings again, or layering, such as adding foreground elements and background elements to frame the subject. And then scale. When it comes to shooting something like scale, you can shoot a wide angle shot with a tiny subject to make the setting look vast. However, you can also use a telephoto lens to compress the background, thus bringing it seemingly closer to the subject, which can in turn make it look bigger. We call this technique compression. It's a technique that even though it's something the lens does for us, focal length choice is in our control, and when we choose the focal length intentionally, it can be really impactful. That's why we often talk about zooming with our feet rather than zooming with the lens. But we'll talk about zoom lenses in a minute. First, there's another big reason you might want to use a telephoto lens, such as getting close when you can't. Sometimes you want to shoot across a lake or a sports field or through a large crowd or in a church. Telephoto lenses allow you to get close when you can't. For photographers that can't always get close to their subjects, telephoto lenses or even super telephoto lenses are crucial. The best example of this is probably the wildlife photographer. In fact, it's elk calving season here in our town, and I just saw a photographer with a super telephoto lens photographing the elk at the lake. When you can't or shouldn't get too close to wildlife, using a telephoto lens allows you to bring the wildlife closer to you, at least visually. One thing you'll notice is that sometimes photographers use tripods when shooting with telephoto lenses. It's nice since these lenses are heavy, but the real reason often comes down to camera shake. Because the field of view is narrower and the subject is further away, you have to be a lot more careful with camera shake with telephoto lenses, especially at slower shutter speeds. You'll want to make sure you're shooting at a fast enough shutter speed, at least 1 over the focal length of the lens, or double that to be really safe. I also like to brace my arms to hold the camera steady, or even lean on a wall or a fence or something. I also sometimes exhale and then shoot so that my breathing doesn't impact the camera shake. Or again, you can use a tripod. You can also turn on image stabilization on your lens and camera. Now let me circle back to a topic I alluded to earlier: prime versus zoom lenses. Many zoom lenses are telephoto lenses, but not all telephoto lenses are zoom lenses. A zoom lens just means that you can switch between focal lengths without switching lenses by twisting the zoom ring. A 70 to 200 millimeter lens, for example, can be shot at 70 or at 200 or anywhere in between. A 70 to 200 is a telephoto zoom lens. A 16 to 35 lens, in contrast, is a wide zoom lens. A prime lens is a fixed focal length lens, meaning a 55 lens is only a 55 lens, an 85 lens is only an 85 lens. The only way to get closer to your subject with a prime lens is to move yourself or your subject. Finally, let's just review some practical tips and techniques for shooting with telephoto lenses with some examples. In these examples of compression, you can see how we bring the background closer. This is one of the main reasons I personally choose a telephoto focal length, even for landscape photography, where I typically love my 16 to 35. Shooting with the 70 to 200 helps add focal length variety and just capture different perspectives to add to an image gallery. As I mentioned, sometimes you can't get close, as with wildlife or sports photography. Similarly, you may intentionally choose to get far away from your subject in order to get a cool perspective on them. Telephoto lenses can help you do that, since they can reach across distances to capture a subject. You may want to also play with using a tripod, especially at slower shutter speeds. Tripods really slow you down, so you'll also find yourself being really intentional with your framing. This is great for not having to worry about camera shake. And lastly, don't forget about utilizing that shallow depth of field that telephoto lenses are great at. Get close to your subject and ensure a large distance between your subject and the background. This will help you achieve bokeh blur even at higher f-stop numbers. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.